All right, everyone, welcome to this particular session of the Solex Expo. We are all from Shinydocs here, and we'll be presenting today's session on getting your data right, how to deliver an end-to-end intelligent document ecosystem with Content Suite at the center. It's a large mouthful, but with that, I'm going to hand this off to our VP of Sales, Paul Kleinknecht. Paul, take it away.
Thank you, David. Thanks very much. Hello, everybody. As David suggested, my name is Paul Kleinknecht. I'm the Vice President of Sales at Shinydocs, and I've been here for almost 8 years now. So spent quite a bit of time, not only at Shinydocs, but more importantly, in the OpenText ecosystem. I'm joined today by Norm Friend here, who is a solution consultant for us. Norm has a very interesting background. He has an extensive background working with a large SI in terms of software delivery. He was an OpenText solution consultant, so deep understanding there. But more importantly, he ran an ECM deployment with Shinydocs solutions at a large energy provider more recently. So we're going to take you through a couple slides. We're going to give you a sense of how we see some of these challenges that face the industry. And then Norm's going to give a little bit of a demonstration in terms of how we impact these areas. So we're obviously the central theme why we're all here. We're all here on the back of OpenText success. OpenText is the EIM leader in the industry. From an EIM perspective, each of you probably has a Content Suite or Documentum ECM that you've deployed and have relied upon for some of the biggest challenges in your organization, perhaps any kind of internal, external audits, regulatory compliance. Maybe it's operational efficiency, the idea of searching and finding relevant information that is associated with some of the challenges that your business is trying to mitigate against. Where we fit into the picture is, as I suggested, we've been a long-time partner. We are what's called a OpenText Solex partner, so a technical solution partner. We've been 3-time OpenText Global Partner of the Year. We've been 4-time best-selling, and all that means is that we've just spent some time in some of OpenText's biggest customers globally. So we're going to draw on some of those experiences today. The two problems that we see that are facing enterprise information, there's two. Well, the first one being this idea that you get a very small amount of data actually finds its way into your ECM. So it's often the ECM solution it could be in many organizations a tier 1 solution in terms of importance, but in reality it only has a small single-digit percentage, often below 5% of the data finds its way in. The second problem with that, and the two are somewhat linked, but the second problem is that users just don't care. The typical users don't really care or understand what a records manager does or why it's important. They tend to want to get their job done, and getting their job done often means accessing content from the easiest place that it could be found, which is typically a file share. That is, when you hire a new individual, when your organization onboards employees, nobody's sitting them down to teach them how to use a file share. So we're going to talk a little bit about both of these problems. And so the first challenge of getting data into the system, we're going to talk specifically about understanding your unstructured data. So how do we go across, and I'll just use one of our customer examples that comes to mind because it is a daunting task. They have 1,500 file shares, numerous SharePoint sites, a content server. And so the idea of understanding all of that data at scale is really a challenge. So we're going to speak today about how we can both interrogate, understand the files where they sit, analyze them, and make them actionable for the purpose of getting them into the system of record. The second component of that is this idea of how do we turn that powerful system of record into the easiest file share users have ever seen. So once you get the data into the system, you then have to give them something that is going to be acceptable for these users as they come from their file share experience. And so the approach that we take on that is the Shiny Drive solution for both Content Suite and Documentum. What it is it is an integration with the Windows operating system, so that that powerful back-end system is now accessed directly from Windows Explorer. So the users think they're using an H drive or a P drive or whatever you choose to name it, but it is a Windows Explorer access to your ECM. So that solves obviously the usability, but it also solves a number of other challenges that users have working with complex application types or file types. So what this looks like from a customer perspective, I think this customer out of UK really depicts the problem. So here's an organization that had a couple thousand users. They rolled out Content Suite. This is over a number of years. This is showing document views in Content Server. So you see over a number of years in the white there that despite their efforts to train the users on how to use the system, the users weren't really accessing much content because there wasn't much content in it. So two things happened at that logo there. You see the green Shinydocs logo or Shinydocs logo. So the first thing was that we crawled a number of file shares and we interrogated the files, we prepped the data, and then we ingested it into Content Suite. So they saw a massive increase in the number of files that got into Content Server. The second component of that story happened when we exposed all that Content Suite now with the new data in it. We exposed it as a simple desktop drive. So now users aren't really asked to try Content Server. They're just using Content Server, not because they like Shiny Drive, because they don't know that they're using it. So you can see this is another one of our customers. This is a utility customer. And obviously the data growth, everybody knows that data is growing. You're all dealing with that. When you look at this explosion that this customer is seeing, it's not dissimilar to what you might be seeing in your own environment. And the ECM solutions are just, they're not generally built to handle the number of documents and the volumes that the large enterprise documents our customers are generating. So when you look at the idea of trying to get this kind of volume under control, there has to be a different way to look at it. You have to be able to understand all of the data because all of the data can't go into an ECM system of record. You have to be more selective. You have to be able to action specific data. And in this situation, you can see how important data becomes when Colonial Pipelines was able to be shut down for just with 100 gigs of data. So it really didn't take much to impact the entire western seaboard of energy flow. So why the urgency around unifying information? So obviously we've got this data growth, but the data growth isn't the whole story because back in the 80s, organizations didn't understand their data then when it was quote unquote under control. It was at that time, whatever year it was always more than what an organization could handle. But the requirements on the business today are changing quickly. You have to run analytics. You have to be able to understand your risk modeling in a heavy asset space. You have to be able to run analytics on the customer and the financial services side. So there's a real importance to better drive decision-making through analytical outcomes. And you have to be able to include the data, but the backdrop here in the purple is obviously daunting because we didn't understand the data before, yet it's been growing, yet we need to drive analytics. Well, it's more complicated than that because governance has not gone away. It's increased in terms of importance at a board level item. So I'm guessing that just about each and every one of the organizations on here is probably running some sort of a governance program right now where you're doing some data cataloging, you're trying to clean up the system data. If you're in manufacturing, you're looking to eliminate materials that are associated with products that you no longer sell. So material management from a system data to an unstructured data is just a very challenging task today. But ultimately, what organizations are doing are they're doing line of business transformations. They're moving workloads from on-prem to the cloud. That's great. Everybody talks about that. I'm sure you can get into lots of webinars that speak to that. The challenge with that, though, is that the unstructured data tends to play zero role in that. So if you're transforming a workload or a business and you're not including 80% of the data, you're missing out on a real opportunity. So our approach is obviously to understand the data, but more importantly, to take what we know from the enterprise, leverage what we know from an area that's highly understood, and leverage that across an area which is not really well understood. In this case, that'll be the unstructured data. So this is really a play on Facebook. So Facebook has done the best job, or among the best. There's a few organizations globally that come to mind, like Apple or Google, or I'm going to pick on Facebook here, and they've done a fantastic job at building relationships between data. They understand groups of people, alignment with their interests, not only today, but previously in past years. They know their interests, they know the groups they're part of, they know their orientations. And they're doing that, Facebook's doing that through building relationships between the data. So what does that look like in the enterprise? Well, there's the concept on the top here is where you've got these system data that really represents a small amount of data from a volume perspective. So I'll just pick on the ERP space for there. You've got really important information in there, like on the financial side, invoices, PO numbers, vendor IDs. These are all, each and every one of those identifiers is actually a record. And so when we look at the high volume data across the bottom, you got the file shares, and in the case of that customer I was talking about, say 1,500 file shares, SharePoints and content servers, and it's a lot of data. So there's an opportunity to network that data or unify that data. And so taking the known entities, which we know to be records from the system data, and unify that with the unstructured data. So what that looks like is, if I take a step back and we think about the first problem that we're trying to solve, we were trying to figure out what's the important data. How do we build the data volumes or relevant data volumes in that system of record? How do we find the records? How do we identify them? So by interrogating each and every file, we start to, and doing the entity extraction from that, we're starting to build a database representation of your unstructured data. And then we're able to take the metadata or the records from the system data and use that to enrich that database. So that the outcome is that now we've taken the unstructured data, we've effectively structured it. So now it becomes a database that becomes part of your governance strategy. It starts to feed into your line of business transformation. Records are an outcome of this enrichment process. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to pass this over to Norm, and I'm going to ask him to share a little bit of information now. Unless there's any questions at all, I'm happy to answer those. I've kind of rattled through some things here. Okay, Norm.
Thanks, Paul. So let's start at the beginning in terms of the discovery side. So as we mentioned, we have multiple repositories. Here is a snapshot of a typical organization where at the top you might have some information related to accounting information sitting in a SharePoint site. Below, you might actually have an entire infrastructure of information at the enterprise sitting in a file share. And on the left, you might have some information sitting from a sales department sitting in your content server. And so this is a typical landscape that we find most of our organizations in. So as we mentioned, the first step is really around discovery, right? So in order for us to get to the actions and to the outcomes, what I want to be able to do is take all of that information and bring it into a central location where I can start doing some visualization, some understanding of what we actually have. So all three of those, whether it's SharePoint, whether it's a file share, whether it's content server, I have a bunch of information sitting within each one of these applications, repositories, that we want to start looking at discovering and understanding. So our first step is to actually do an inventory. Then we get information, essential information, like the type of document it is, whether it's been full text or not full text, the creation date, the last modification date, et cetera, et cetera. And so between each one of these applications, we can start getting that inventory or that base understanding. From here, we move into understanding and doing some cleansing. So I'm going to talk about a couple things in the discovery phases. Part of this is cleaning. And so we're going to talk about redundant, obsolete, and trivial. Under redundancy, we talk about duplication, and this happens a lot. So if I were to look at duplication across my entire data set, again, whether it's in a file share or whether it's in content server or whether it's in SharePoint, I can get a sense of how many duplicate files do I have in here. And these duplicate files can be, again, across every single one of these locations. We use by default an MD5 algorithm to identify a hash. But now we can actually understand what are some of the top duplicates I have in my organization. Then we move into some of the other cleansing activities. So as I mentioned, redundancy, which we've talked about in terms of duplicates, but we also have things like email copies. When it comes to obsolete information, things that really don't have much relevancy anymore, files that have been unused for 7 years. Maybe it's an old draft file. Maybe it's a log file that we only have to keep for X number of months. And then trivial information would be things like old drafts, 0-byte files, files with no extension, just general noise. So what we're doing is we're taking this haystack of content and doing some cleansing to actually start reducing that haystack to relevant information. In some of the organizations, we've seen anywhere from 30 to 60% of rot through our discovery. So next step is now we start getting into how can we start understanding what this information is. And so we start looking at breaking things down based on who owns that content, based on some general entities that we can extract. So again, part of the discovery phase is pulling out common entities. It could be a date, could be currency. In this case, these are names. These are the most common names we find in all of our documents. We can start breaking things down into document types. So is this a sales proposal? Is this a purchase order? Is this an employee review? What's the sensitivity of this information? So what we start doing is building, again, that fabric across all of these repositories to start understanding what that information is. So once we've gotten all of this information, we understand a little bit more, then we can start talking about, to Paul's point, unifying this information with the rest of the data that we have in our organization. So let's take the scenario of a purchase order. So if you look at a given purchase order, in my case, I'm going to put this side by side from the unstructured data to the structured data to the structured data. So on the left-hand side here, I have an extract that came from my ERP system. This could have come from a data catalog that we've already done some ETL work. It could have come straight from our ERP system, but I have a bunch of data here relevant to all of my purchase orders. And as you can see, there's a bunch of data here that I may like the company name, but the street address, city. This is all that data entity on the actual vendor, as well as the purchase orders that were made for those vendors. On the right, I have the actual purchase order document. And you'll notice that things like the purchase order number, the vendor number are sitting within this document. So now that we've done that cleansing of the haystack, what we want to start doing is aligning this information or unifying it with the rest of the data that we have within our organization. And so by taking the purchase order and the relevant information, we can now start looking at, through a number of different enrichment techniques, what those purchase orders look like within the Shinydocs index. So now at this point, I see a whole bunch of purchase orders. I can see their names here. I can pull up their path. Again, it doesn't matter where these are. And I've enriched it with all of this metadata from the purchase order ID, the subtotal, the tax, the total, the PO date, the vendor that's associated with it, maybe even the vendor name. As we mentioned, the fact that I know that this is now a purchase order, I can start applying records management classifications to this information. So this gets back to that understanding. So we've done this initial discovery of all of our repositories. We now look at understanding that information by aligning it with, in this case, line of business with the ERP. It's no different whether it's information based on employee. When we look at entity enrichment in general, it could be text patterning. It could be any list of information that you have, whether it be a work order ID, whether it be an employee name, whether it be any other asset identifier within our organization. So once we get here, now we start getting into the actioning side. So the benefits and the outcomes of understanding all this. Now that I know that these are all purchase orders, I can do things like this. I can say, I'm now going to move every single one of those purchase orders into Content Server. And guess what? I want to structure it by year. This just happens to be how I want to structure my purchase order information in Content Server. And so you can see under my purchase orders here, and I knew I was going to have to log in again. I've broken it down. I've chosen to broken it down by year and month. And so if I just want to look at the actual documents that were put in here, you'll notice, again, these documents are very similar to the documents we just saw in our discovery page. And so what we've done is we've migrated them here. And now I get to do things like, from a Content Server perspective, I have all of that category information now applied to it. So I can search on a purchase order number. I can search on the date. I can do date ranges. Now that this has been enriched in Content Server, I can leverage Content Server. I can leverage even things like, I want to put this into a connected workspace. And again, I have a purchase order that was set up, again, part of, I don't want to open it or download it. Part of a file share where I've done enrichment by bringing this together with everything in my line of business application. And now I can leverage all of the functions and features within OpenText to be able to say, all right, great. So now I have this purchase order assigned to this business workspace. And if I look at the document properties of that document, all of the information, including the records classification. So I was able to say that this is FIN 10010. It's supposed to be kept for a current year +5. The status date is 2014. I can now run disposition on this document, and this will get flagged for ready for destruction. You'll also notice I have information like the type of sensitivity. It's confidential information. The content type is purchase orders, and all of the purchase order information that we just finished enriching it with is now part of our Content Server environment. So when we look at things like extended ECM in general, we have built this infrastructure to be able to communicate with the business objects with any of these ERP systems, HCM systems, CRM systems that we use. What we can now do is leverage that and populate and migrate all of the content into those workspaces so that now that information is now organized within Content Server. So a result of something like that would be, I can now create dashboards because I have the metadata. You can actually see which parent IDs these are all belong to. Here's the file names. Here's the retention that we've applied to it. And I can now see information based on our yearly totals of purchase orders within Content Server. This is no different than a web report you would create in Content Server. But again, I can have that holistic picture. So that's problem number one. How do we actually increase the ROI and the investment of an ECM by getting more content in there? And it's by discovering it and understanding it and then actioning it to decide where to move it to. The second thing is, how do we now get people to use this? So let's go back to the first thing that we showed, which was this concept right here. Our users used to going into this accounting folder and looking at their information here. Now that we've migrated this information, I've called mine a G drive, but now this is Content Server. So we're not asking users to change their behavior in terms of how they work with information. So if I actually go to vendor management, we talked about supporting business workspaces and extended ECM. There's my vendor. There's my finance documents. And there's that purchase order we just finished looking at within the OpenText Smart View. If I right-click this, again, we want to create feature functions that users are used to using. And so from a Shiny Drive perspective, as I said, we're surfacing that content now in a file share that users are comfortable in using to work. So I can go to things like, I can look at the categories that have been applied to this particular document. And again, as we saw before, the fact that it's sensitive, is confidential, the content type, and all of the purchase order information is available to users in the file share in that workspace that they're used to working with. I can also show things like the records classification. So from a records management perspective, I want to actually look at all of the records classifications that were assigned to it. Where is, oh, it's not there. I also can look at the versions. So this particular document, again, created 8 years ago. When we do our migration, we still satisfy all the creation, modification, last access dates when it gets migrated and ported over into OpenText. That's super important, especially when it comes to the records management component. So from a usability and a cost of adoption perspective, we're not asking users to change when they're used to something like this within their environment, and we're asking them to switch to something like this, which is essentially exactly what they're used to using and working with today.
Thank you, Norm. That was a great job. Thanks for taking the group through that. So at the end of the day, we were solving two major problems. Obviously, understanding how we get data into the system. Norm took you through a good understanding of how we understand that data in place, and then build some analytics around it so that we can actually start to make decisions on it. Clearly, this type of an interface, this is a screen capture from Windows Explorer. We are not creating an Explorer-like interface. This is Windows Explorer, and you can appreciate that this is going to be very easy for users to adopt, because there really isn't anything to adopt. But now, once you start to go through that and you understand that data, you can really start to draw some good analogies and run some analytics on specific items. So that you think about that database and the power that it now represents is you've got this fidelity and understanding of the data and the entities from the extraction. And so this is showing a city of Toronto, you can see, is broken up into various wards by these dots here. And they were interested in understanding their real estate assets and the leases associated with them. And so we crawled the data and did an extraction on this unstructured lease related data. And so then we were able to marry that up with lat longs, again, just more system data. And what eventually happens is you can now geolocate your documentation that is associated with, in this case, assets. And so now this is a dynamic interface. Obviously, you'll be able to drill into any of one of these wards and understand the associated contracts or leases that are associated with it. So this is not difficult to do. This is not a huge engagement. In fact, 80% of this was done by a clever salesperson that we had who was quite savvy, but by no means was a developer, by no means was an operator of our technology. So, but this is some of the capability that it starts to present you these opportunities to look at various problems. And that's the approach. So I hope that you got a good understanding of how we impact the two areas that were discussed. Certainly see lots of opportunity to drive incremental value from these investments that you've made in Documentum Content Server. And getting the data into it is one thing. Getting users to access it and use it is another. And anything that we can do to shed some light or even share more information, please feel free to reach out. My email's on here. And I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks, folks.